Hi, podcast listeners. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. We have so many guests on this show making a difference in our lives, making a difference all around the world with the expertise that they bring. And yet so many of you are reaching out to me saying, you want more. It's not enough just what we're putting on these podcast episodes for you. And so I am here to extend a very warm welcome to you to our Difference Maker community, where you can join for as little as $5 a month to get all this extra content. Out the gate, you're going to get 30 plus minisodes of exclusive content not available for the regular podcast listeners, and an exclusive minisode every month. And you'll get exclusive voting power to help us pick podcast topics and more. And that's at our Changers tier. There's 3 different main tiers and then an extra larger tier. But whatever tier that you join at, you will be included in this extra content. And I know that many of you are wanting to go a little bit deeper. And so even though it gets a little wild in there sometimes because of how deep we go, I want you to join us there. This extra content is very special. It means a great deal to me to be a part of this community with you. And I would love to just exchange ideas or perspectives that you have around these different episodes. And that's the place where we do it. So please show up to our Difference Maker community. Give us $5 out of your pocket every month. And I think that you'll have a lot of fun in there because we do. And I would love for you to join us. So go to patreon.com/A World of Difference to join us there. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. I'm Lori Adams Brown, and this is a podcast for those who are different and want to make a difference. Our guest today is Reverend Kyle Meyaard-Schaap, and he serves as the Vice President of the Evangelical Environmental Network. For the past 10 years, he's educated and mobilized Christians around the world to address the climate crisis as an act of discipleship and neighbor love. Kyle has been named to Midwest Energy Group's 40 Under 40, the American Conservation Coalition's 30 Under 30, and the Grist 50 Fixers cohorts for his work on climate change education and advocacy. In 2020, he was named a Yale Public Voices on the Climate Crisis Fellow, and his work has been featured in national and international news outlets such as PBS, NPR, CNN, NBC News, New York Times, Reuters, U.S. News and World Report. And his book, which I'm very excited to introduce you to if you've not yet read it, is called Following Jesus in a Warming World, A Christian Call to Climate Action. And it was released this February. Kyle is married to Allison and lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan with their 2 sons. And he is on the show today talking about how he recently celebrated Earth Day and how we can do a better job of caring for this planet we all know and love. So welcome to the show today, Kyle Meyaard-Schaap. Hello, Kyle. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Lori.
Well, it's so exciting to talk about this topic. This book that you've written is really unique, and I am really excited to dig into a little bit of what you've written here today for our audience. We've recently celebrated Earth Day, but every day here at the World of Difference podcast is a good day to just be so grateful to be on this planet and all the diversity that lies in it. So how was your Earth Day? And do you have any particular thing you've done year after year that's like a tradition, or do you do something different every year? How does that go for you?
Yeah, so I spent Earth Day with about 400 other close friends / strangers at an event that I helped plan and host called Indie Creation Fest. So this is a really cool story if we have time for it.
We do.
I've been working with some volunteers in Indianapolis for a couple of years now. And it came out of this conversation that I just had with a couple pastors in the area around how do we help our people understand our call to care for creation and not kind of beat people over the head with it, but invite them into something joyful, something life-giving, something winsome. So they pulled together some volunteers from their church that they knew were already excited about this. And they came up with this idea for Indie Creation Fest. It's essentially an open house fair style event with vendors and tables all over the place. There's food trucks, there's electric vehicles that people can look at. There are rescue animals, pot-bellied pigs that the kids can pet. There are beekeepers and composters, and it's just a great time for people to be together in God's creation, learning about what other people are doing, how they can get plugged in to that work, and just celebrating the goodness of creation and the goodness of being creatures in creation. So that's how I spent my Earth Day. My family came down with me, a few hours drive from home. So it was a lot of fun. To your other question, I don't have any Earth Day traditions. I just kind of bounce around and find stuff that's interesting if I'm not working like I was this past year. But being in my line of work, I'm usually quite busy around Earth Day.
I would imagine so. Well, what a fun event. Yeah, there's just so many different ways to celebrate Earth Day. I find it fascinating what people do, what traditions they have, or whether they do something different every year. Yeah, we live here in the Bay Area in California. There's all kinds of opportunities to do things. As you could imagine, this place is pretty active around this type of day. And even the job I do in Silicon Valley, there was a special event at my workplace where I work in tech around just how our company is doing with sustainability and, what our goals are and how we're meeting them. And just so we all understand. And that's really important as an aspect of Earth Day as well. Unfortunately, earlier, like a little over a month ago, our rescue dog that we brought from Singapore passed away. She was just a little old lady, and we cared for her to the very end. It's super tough. And so we have signed up to be foster families for a rescue here in California until we feel ready to find a new rescue dog to just bring into our home. But Earth Day was a little different for us this year because of that. But we do believe in our family very strongly in caring for creation, and also that none of us can do enough by ourselves, that we really we need each other as a family. We need our communities. We need our world really to link arms and come together. So your book is all about this, but you also kind of dig into a little bit in the book your own personal narrative. So my first question for you was, when did you really begin to understand the need to be involved in creation care?
Yes. So I grew up in the Midwest in Western Michigan in a pretty conservative Christian family and community. I went to Christian day school from kindergarten through 12th grade. And it was a beautiful community that taught me a lot of really important lessons and values. And it didn't have much to teach me about my relationship to the natural world around me and what my faith had to say about any of that. That began to change for me when my older brother, who's a few years older than me, went on a semester abroad program to New Zealand. This was a Christian study abroad program that took kids from Christian colleges, brought them to New Zealand, and had them study at the intersection of ecology, biology, and scripture, theology, church history, bringing faith and science into conversation together in one of the most beautiful pieces of God's creation.
Yeah.
And he came back totally transformed. I think the climax for me, in my memory at least, is when he announced soon after he came home that he was now a vegetarian because of his learning and his experiences. And literally it was as if he had said to our family, like, I'm a dog now. That's who I am. Right. Like, it was so out of left field. I didn't know anybody like me who had ever made that decision. I couldn't fathom anyone like me making that decision. So I had a hard decision to make. Was I going to lump my brother into this caricature that I had built up around quote unquote vegetarians, which was false because I didn't have any real life experience with it? Or was I going to suspend my assumptions and hear him out? And he was gracious and kind and patient in helping me understand his journey. And what he revealed to me is that choice that he had made was not him rejecting the values that we had been taught in our conservative Christian community. It was him doing his best to try to live more deeply into them. And that was the first time that anyone had given me permission to think about something like environmental care, or the flip side of it, environmental degradation, pollution, climate change, through the lens of my faith, and to understand that I could take action because I'm a Christian, because I'm trying to follow Jesus, and not in spite of it. So that was kind of my spark that got fanned into flame when I went to college and had my own experiences after that, that we could dig into, but that I also write about in the book as well. Meeting people who are on the front lines of climate impacts, and having stories and faces to put to these big issues that can feel abstract, can feel theoretical, but got really human really quickly for me.
Mm. It's not easy for a brother to change a brother's mind in a culture that's that entrenched. So I really loved reading that part of your story. And I mean, who doesn't go to New Zealand and all of a sudden have awe and wonder about God's creation?
Yeah.
And my experience of living and working in Asia, I had several Kiwi friends, and they, would often joke about American Christians and our lack of understanding about basic things like the ozone layer and holes in the ozone layer, and and how that like directly affects their country in ways that are harmful, and that type of thing. But in your book, you talk about that, climate change really is a moral issue that Christians should be really not only concerned about, but have calls to action, essentially, to be a part of helping link arms and change things together. So explain how that looks for you and how you think as Christians we should be involved.
Yeah. So you're right. I want to help the church understand climate change with our own language, right? Language that we understand, the language of Scripture, and the language of morality, right? The Scripture is very clear, and Jesus is very clear that the most important aspect of what it means to follow after him is to love God with everything we've got, and to love our neighbor as if their current circumstances and their future prospects were our own. And when I look out at a world being pressed on by climate change, being pressed on unequally, it should be said, right? Certain people are feeling the impacts of climate change more strongly than others. When I look out at that, I don't know how to love God and to love my neighbor without doing something about forces that are destroying God's good creation that God loves and tells us to love and care for, and forces that are making it harder for my neighbor to feed their families, to pay their bills, to be safe, and to flourish and thrive in a healthy creation as we were all intended to. So I often say, I found my way into this work not as a Democrat or a Republican, not even as an environmentalist, right? I'm a pastor. I'm an ordained pastor. I studied religion in college. I went to seminary. I'm doing this because I'm trying to follow Jesus. I don't know how else to follow Jesus in the 21st century. When Jesus says, love God and love your neighbor, and when I look out and I see that climate change is making both of those things harder to do. So yeah, I do think that climate change is a moral issue, and as such, it requires that the church wakes up, stands up, and does something about it. So in terms of what does that look like, I write a bit in the book that I think it looks different for everybody, and here's why. I believe that caring for creation is a fundamental part of every human being's vocation, because that's how God made us, right? If you go all the way back to Genesis, we see that the first commands that God gives to humans in Genesis 1 and in Genesis 2 are to rule over creation, to subdue it. Those are strong words that the church has often misinterpreted, in my opinion. But in Genesis 2, it says, serve and protect it, right? So rule creation, but rule it through service. Rule creation, but rule it by protecting it. Rule as I rule, because I'm creation's true king, says Jesus, right? And how does Jesus rule creation? Well, Jesus trades heaven for a womb. Jesus washes feet. He climbs up on a cross. Jesus rules through humility and sacrifice and service by seeking the good of that which is ruled. And our rulership is derivative of Christ's. So if we're going to rule creation, we have to rule as Christ rules, and that's through service and sacrifice and protection. And so as such, every human being has this holy vocation put on them, right? We are earth keepers. This is part of what it means to be a human being. And so every one of us has this calling on our lives, but just like your vocation, Lori, is different than my vocation. I think everybody's unique calling to respond to the realities of environmental degradation and climate change is different. So I don't want to prescribe for anyone how God has uniquely made them to tend creation, to care for creation, and to protect it. I think there are broad principles that we could discuss that I get into in the book a little bit, that kind of umbrellas that all of us sit underneath, and there are lots of options underneath those big umbrellas. But I think most basically, everybody, as part of their vocation, has earthkeeping, has an earthkeeping box, right? This is part of your calling, whether you know it or not, because you're a human on planet Earth. And I think one of the invitations that I want to offer to people is get familiar with the unique ways that God has created you to live into that vocation. Find practices that bring you joy. Because I can tell you, like, when you try to implement and institute practices in your life to try to care for creation or live more gently on the earth, and if your motivation is guilt and drudgery and obligation, you get burned out really fast. But when you enter into it with the idea of vocation, and you think, okay, how have I been wired to connect with creation? What brings me life and joy in creation? And what are practices that can enhance my experience of creation and enhance my own sense of self? That's when we find joy. And as a Christian, I believe that's where we find God's joy, because God takes joy and delight in creation. Scripture is clear about that. And when we find ways to find joy in creation, we're participating in God's joy. And that is a gift, right? I think all too often we talk about creation care practices as obligations rather than gifts. But this is an invitation to become more human and to participate in the joy that God has in God's creation. So one of the things I'm trying to do is reframe for the church how we even think about this, right? This doesn't have to be guilt and shame and blame inducing. This is a beautiful, exhilarating invitation to become more human and to participate in God's joy.
Yeah, it's so good. Honestly, wherever we live on the planet, there's, usually unique opportunities to enjoy even just the outdoors that can really look different in like an urban jungle, so to speak, but where it's smoggy and maybe not as easy. But whether it's enjoying a beach nearby or a rainforest or a mountain or in California, we're blessed to have both, like cliffs on the ocean, which is just absolutely gorgeous. It is. My friend Nancy Ortberg, I've heard her describe worship as awe and wonder. And she likes to go surfing too. We live near Santa Cruz. I live in the same town as her. And we're like without traffic, 15 minutes from where surfing came to the mainland in the US. So there's a lot of people out there, that every time I go, they're just surfing, and I would never get in that cold water and surf like that. But it does cause me awe and wonder just to watch how the waves, crash against the cliffs, or the sunshine, as it feels on your skin, especially on a cold day. It just feels wonderful. And a reminder that, climate is changing and we have a role to play. And if it's just, all three of our kids have been scouts at different points, especially in our Singapore years, where they would pick up trash in parks and things like that. Relatively, Singapore is much more clean than the average country because they have strict laws against throwing trash on the ground. You get fined like a lot of money, like $500 to $1,000 for doing that.
Wow.
I know. And they do enforce those laws. So it's why it's beautiful. And it's called the Garden City because it's got gardens everywhere. It was designed by Lee Kuan Yew, who loved gardening. But there are very different ways we can participate in helping the world be a better place. And like you said, I think it's important to choose something that is naturally something we're inclined toward, as opposed to putting on some system that feels like drudgery. Because there are so many ways to care for our earth. And so what are some of the ways that you have found maybe are surprising to people, or are things they often wouldn't think about that can be ways we can steward our planet well?
Yeah, I love that question. Yeah, so some of the ways that I've been surprised by in my own journey, in my own life, and some of the ways that I think people are interested in. One is just your own landscaping around your house, right? Um, Turf lawns are not particularly natural, right? There's this aesthetic in the United States, especially around uniformly cut grass, manicured lawns, and a lot of the plants are non-native, which means ecologically they're pretty useless. They're pretty to look at, but they're not serving much of a purpose in your local place. So one of the things that I've been learning more about, and that my wife are trying to implement in our own home, is native landscaping. So learning about what are the plants that are indigenous to your place, that serve an ecological function in your place, whether it's feeding pollinators, filtering rainwater. And that's becoming more and more important in the place where I live in the Midwest, because some of the predictions for climate impacts in the Midwest are more intense precipitation events. So maybe not necessarily more rain, but more rain all at once, as well as more heat. So when we talk about stormwater management, native plants actually have a really important role to play, because turf grass has really, really short root systems. And when water falls on turf, very little of it soaks down into the ground, which means most of it runs off our lawns, runs off of our hard pavement, picking up all of the oils and particulates and the gross stuff on the street with it and going straight into our stormwater. And I live right on a creek called Plaster Creek, which is the most polluted water, one of the most polluted waterways in the state of Michigan, because we have very poor stormwater management. So this summer, my wife and I applied through a local organization, and we were approved to get a rain garden put in our front yard with native species, native plants. And one of the things about native plants is their root systems are much, much longer, which means they suck more moisture, more water down into the ground to manage it. So it's not all running off the street into Plaster Creek. It's contained and it's filtered, and it reaches the water table more slowly. And when it reaches the water table, it's much cleaner. It filters out a lot of those toxins that would otherwise be swept into Plaster Creek. And I just think it's really pretty. Like there's these beautiful flowers that the bees and the butterflies and the pollinators can sip on. So that's one thing that I've really enjoyed learning about, all of the benefits of it. And I just think it's really pretty, and it makes for really interesting landscaping. So even stuff like that, like thinking about what do you have planted around your house? Is it native? If not, why not? And what are some natives that you could potentially put in native to your place that the insects and the pollinators and the birds have all grown used to being in relationship with and eating from, or being shaded by? And how can you even bring your own patch of land into better harmony with the natural ecosystem around you? Not just because it looks pretty, but because it can help mitigate some of those climate impacts too.
Oh, what a wonderful way. I know several people that listen to the podcast that enjoy gardening. So hopefully that gave some people some ideas. On a different turn, sort of the elephant in the room is the fact that some Christians listening don't even, I know I'm speaking probably largely to white evangelicals in the United States at this moment that listen or have relatives in that camp or friends. Sometimes people can be skeptical around this whole conversation of climate change because of a variety of false narratives or misleading narratives that have been part of media consumption in the U.S., or maybe even things they've heard in their own churches from their own pastors' mouths. So, how do you think your book is going to be received by Christians who might be skeptical of climate change or who prioritize other issues over this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I hope that folks who might have some questions around climate change would find my book to be. I hope at the very least my book is gracious. I tried very hard to write in such a way that nobody felt judged, nobody felt belittled or put down if they have questions about climate change, or because I understand it, right? Like I used to. I haven't always understood what I understand now about climate change, and I used to be skeptical and kind of side eye it a little bit myself. And I had to go on a journey myself, and I needed people to help me along that journey. So I always try to remember that everybody's on a journey, and nobody deserves to be judged or ridiculed for wherever they are on that journey. I do hope that people who might be skeptical will approach the book at least with some openness, because I do think there are theological, economic, political reasons why skepticism of climate change is almost a uniquely American phenomenon.
Yeah.
It exists in Australia too. It exists in the UK and Canada to a certain extent, but it's largely wealthy Western countries where this skepticism persists. One of my overwhelming takeaways from going to the COP15 climate change conference in Paris COP21 in 2015, got those numbers mixed up, in 2015 in Paris, where the Paris Agreement was ultimately reached. My overwhelming takeaway was everybody is around the table here. Like even Saudi Arabia was at the table, and their entire existence depends on sucking out oil from the earth and selling it, right? So of course they were slow walking everything. They were trying to water down the language, but they weren't at the table saying climate change is a hoax.
Right.
That is a uniquely American phenomenon. And I think there are particular reasons for that. There's a political story that has formed a lot of Christians in this country that tells us that to be a good Christian in public, and to engage in political issues as a Christian, requires concern around a handful of issues, and the environment isn't one of them. Climate change is kind of excluded from our concern, and it's even viewed with some fear around, could it be a Trojan horse to kind of take our money, take our freedom? And so there's a political story that has formed a lot of Christians that has said climate change is outside of your concern. It has nothing to do with a Christian public theology or a Christian political theology, so you don't have to worry about it. So a lot of Christians just were never told that it was something that they needed to concern themselves with as they engaged in public conversations around issues that affect their communities. I think there's a theological story too that is shaped by kind of the philosophical dualism of Greek philosophy that infused so much of the early church and we continue to drink downstream from, a philosophy that separated the spiritual and the material and said that the spiritual is what's ultimate, the spirit and the soul is what matters most, and the material is passing away, it's imperfect, we don't have to concern ourselves with it. And it gave rise to this theology that elevated human souls over against human bodies, and it elevated heaven over earth, and it separated all of these things that, in my opinion, were never meant to be separated. When you look at particularly the Old Testament, this idea of a separation between soul and body, separation between heaven and earth, these things were foreign to the ancient Hebrews. And it was really only with Hellenistic thinking, kind of this merging of Greek philosophy with the way of Jesus in the early centuries of the church, that we began to see this dualism creep in to our theology. And again, we're formed by it today still, right? How many of us were told, we don't have to worry about things like climate change. We just have to save souls. We have to worry about saving souls. And how many of us were told that the ultimate hope of the Christian story is heaven, right? We got to get to heaven. And we forget about how scripture actually tells us that the hope is not ultimately heaven. It's what happens after heaven when Jesus comes back in his resurrected body, and all of us join him in resurrected bodies, and we live forever here in this place in a renewed heaven and a renewed earth. So again, I think theology too has overemphasized the spiritual over the material, and has told us that we don't have to worry about the earth. We don't have to worry about bodies. We don't have to worry about physical material things, because that's not what's ultimate. What's ultimate is the spirit and the soul and heaven. And I think it should be said too, there has been a pretty concerted and pretty successful campaign from the parties in power who stand to benefit the most from maintaining the status quo, fossil fuel corporations, right. A pretty concerted effort to muddy the public conversation around climate change. This is not theoretical. There's data to back this up, right? Like we have documents from ExxonMobil that said in the 1980s, we have a pretty good idea of what climate change is going to do, and we need to confuse the public so that we can continue digging up and exporting fossil fuels for as long as possible. So we've also been the victims of a pretty successful PR campaign and propaganda campaign to confuse the American public about the consensus among climate scientists around climate change, about the effects, the expected impacts of climate change, about humanity's role in driving climate change. All of that has been confused on purpose because there are people who benefit from the status quo and who don't want anything to change. And they have a lot of money to make sure that the status quo stays the same. So there's a lot of reasons, and I explore a lot of this in my book. There's a lot of reasons, I think, why particularly Christians here in the US have found it hard to understand what climate change has to do with our faith, or what people of faith might be required to do in response to something like climate change. And again, I want to finish my answer by saying, I don't want to blame anybody for that, right? Like we've been told stories, and stories are powerful. Stories form us. And none of us created these stories. We were told them. And I think part of the task of faithful discipleship is recognizing what are the stories I've been told that are from God, and what are the stories I've been told that are not of God. And I think some of those political stories, those theological stories, those maybe socio-cultural stories around truth and how can we be sure what truth is, some of those stories are not of God. And we have to recover God's story, which I try to do in the book a bit by looking at scripture, looking at the greatest commandment that Jesus gives us, to love God and love our neighbor, and to realize actually this story that forms us, the story of God's work in the world through Jesus Christ, has everything to do with what climate change is doing to God's world and to my neighbor. And I'm invited to be a part of responding to that.
Yeah, so helpful to understand. I think when we can just have, clarity in our conversations, and, clarity is kindness. It may be uncomfortable to just say things the way that they are, but it's kind to us, our souls, our brains, and our bodies, all the integrated forms of that, right? Yeah. And the earth that we get to live on, that hopefully for generations we can preserve for those we love and care about. And I think that, there are some uniquely American aspects to this, because so many other cultures I've lived in, for example, have been collectivist cultures, and this understanding that we need one another, not just to survive, but to thrive. And so that implies understanding how we are on this global planet, and even in our communities. And, it's, much data to support that communities around the world that may have less means than, say, for example, the United States does, are, especially in some areas that are, islands that are at risk for rising sea levels. I mean, these things are impacting parts of the world more than others. So they get a firsthand, look at it, and the way they share the narratives around what's happening can be different. But it can be really hard on a psychological level to admit we were wrong and we are currently wrong, and that
Yeah.
people told us things that aren't true. It's not comfortable for us to say, the media I've consumed, the pastors I've listened to, the books I've read, the community that's raised me and taught me has been telling me something that was based on maybe greed from ExxonMobil in the
Mm-hmm.
80s. It's a really hard thing to admit to oneself.
Yeah.
And it can feel as though the whole world is spinning out of control to even question that.
Yeah.
So I do want to just hold space for how hard that can be to change one's mind. But I think Gen Z is hopefully helping us to say, we don't live in a world where we can ignore this anymore. Like,
Right.
they understand it on a different level. So I have a lot of hope that if we listen to the younger generation, they'll help us. What are you hoping readers can take away from your book and that will inspire them for climate change action?
Yeah. I think that's such an important point. Thank you for making that and for holding space for that. And because it is really hard. It is really hard. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to write the book is because so many young Christians that I was speaking to over the course of my work were telling me such a similar story about how they came to understand that the stories that they had been told were incomplete, and maybe even false in some circumstances, and how painful it was to recognize that and to kind of walk the road of listening again to different stories, or finding the courage to open yourself up to different sources of information. And I think one of the things that I hope people might take away, who have felt that way, is that they're not alone. That they're not alone in recognizing that some of the stories they may have been told growing up were harmful and were incomplete and were false. They're not alone in recognizing that the church has been compromised by a lot of those stories, and they're not alone in their passion for wanting to see the church do better. I know a lot of young Christians in particular who have done the first step. They've recognized that the stories they've heard are harmful or wrong, and then they walk away, right? And I everybody is on their own journey, and if that's what you needed to do for your own spiritual and physical health, and mental health especially, zero judgment, right? I recognize that everybody has their own story and they have to walk their road. At the same time, there are a lot of young Christians who grew up with a lot of these stories that we've been talking about, who have recognized how problematic they are and have tried to call that out in the church, because they still love the church, right? They still believe that the church can be what they were taught it is, and they were taught it can be. And they want to help the church be better. And that can be really, really hard. So one thing that I hope readers can take away is the realization that there are literally millions of us out there that recognize that the church's stories around creation, around climate change, they've been deficient for a long, long time, and the church can and should and needs to do better. And that if you feel alone in calling for that in your church or on your Christian campus or in whatever context you may be in, you are not. There are so many of us out there that are trying to help the church do better. And that's one of the things I write in the book too, is that the work of Christian climate action, of trying to do this work as an expression of our discipleship and love of Jesus, has to happen in community. It has to happen in community, because it's too hard otherwise. And so one of the things I hope people are inspired to do is to find your people. That might be at your church, and it might not. It might be people you went to high school with that you haven't connected with, but who post interesting things on Facebook that you kind of resonate with. It might be people from college. It might be people you met at the Earth Day event that you went to locally last week, right? Whoever they are, find your people and do this work with them, because there are days when it's really, really hard to hold hope that we're going to turn the ship around as quickly as we need to. And when you have those days, you need people to hold hope for you. And when you are finding it easier to hold hope, you need to hold that for other people who are having a harder time holding hope. So I hope that people will be encouraged, not only that, there are millions of us out there somewhere, but also encouraged to find some of those millions wherever you are, in your community, and to do this together, because it has to be done together.
It does have to be done together. It's too overwhelming even to just picture what it could look like by ourselves. And
Yeah.
yet, your epilogue in the book is really beautiful and unusual. And I wanted to just give you a chance to help us have that vision you have, as a grandpa and a granddaughter in the year 2066, and
Mm-hmm.
what kind of vision you're hoping for that we can work toward.
Yes, thank you. I had a lot of fun writing my epilogue. So the epilogue is a letter to my imagined one day, perhaps, granddaughter. I do have two sons, 5 and 15 months. So and I date it May 2066, imagining writing this to my granddaughter someday on her commencement day. And I wanted to write this for a couple reasons. One, because I think conversations about climate change tend to be far too stuck in the problem, and far less often focused on the opportunities that climate change offers, the opportunities to create a better world, a safer world, a healthier world, a more vibrant, prosperous world, a world where more people can flourish and thrive, and a world more like how we want it to be, right? I think the climate movement, quote unquote, however you want to think about that, has been really, really good at helping the public understand the challenges we face, and the dangers in front of us, but far less good at casting a vision for an inspiring future that we can all create together by taking action. So that was one of the things I wanted to do, was to try to cast a vision, and say, what might the world look like, if the church does get its act together and start leading in the ways that it needs to lead on this issue. And another reason I wanted to do it is because I wanted to model what it looks like to exercise our muscle of imagination. I think imagination is really, really important when it comes to addressing something like climate change, because, like you said, it is so big, it can be so overwhelming. And I think we have to be able to imagine our way out of it in some senses. We have to be able to imagine what kind of world we can create by taking action together. So I not only wanted to kind of exercise that muscle myself, I wanted to model for the reader what it might look like to try to imagine, and to cast a positive vision for a future, that we might yet be able to achieve if we can take action. But I also I didn't want it to be too saccharine, right? I wanted it to feel real and honest. I didn't want it to be trite. So I do acknowledge that the world that she lives in is different than my world, right? That the impacts of climate change are going to make the world look different in 2066 than it does now. Even if we stop emitting greenhouse gases today, there's a lot of warming that's already baked in. And I grapple with that. I grapple with this idea of, how do you hold fear and hope at the same time? Is it a failure to be afraid? And what does it mean for hope if you're also afraid at the same time? Afraid specifically for the future of my kids and my grandkids. So it was a meaningful thing for me to write, and I hope it can help people kind of catch a glimpse for, what does it look like to try to imagine the type of future we want to create for ourselves and for the people we love, but also still honor the fact that, even when we have hope, and even when we're acting in hope, it's okay to still be afraid. And I think sometimes, that's the only time we can have hope, is when we're afraid, because if there aren't circumstances that are causing you to be afraid or to be in fear, to have fear, then what is that other future you're hoping for to begin with? So I guess I wanted to name that for people and make it okay for them to, if they're feeling afraid, because I do.
Yeah. So good. Yeah. Just right before I mean, this morning when I was talking to my husband, he was reading a Dan Allender book and he read out loud this
Mm,
quote to me, really close to that. It was had to do with risk taking. People who hope take risks, and taking risk, you're afraid, but you actually have this audacity of
yeah,
hope that you believe that this risk is worth it, even if you're afraid. And that's
yeah,
kind of the essence of what hope is. And I thank you for ending the book in this way. It's a beautiful book. To those listening, pick up this book and read it. It's really well written and full of narratives and compassion for those who may have some fears around it or are having trouble changing your mind. And we hold space for all of that here as well. I would love to let people know where to find you. So if you could let people know where to find more of your writing and keep in touch with you throughout your journey of what is going to be coming out next.
yes. So you can find a lot of my other writings and get in touch with me if you want to at my website, KyleMeyaard-Schaap.com. You can also find me at creationcare.org. That's the website for my organization, the Evangelical Environmental Network, where I serve as the vice president. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram, Facebook. So I'm pretty findable, as long as you know how to spell my name. So
Which is, yeah,
That's another reason to pick up the book, so that you can read my name off the cover and you know how to
there you
spell it.
go. Yes. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for being on the show today, for all your work to help our planet be a home for all of us, for our great grandkids too. And may it be true that one day your granddaughter can have a vision fulfilled on her commencement day, where we have done this work together to preserve the world for her. Thanks for being on the show today, Kyle. I really appreciate you.
Amen. Thanks, Lori.
Well, I hope that you were inspired today by just the work that Kyle is doing, the calls to action he was inviting us into, opportunities to change our minds and be curious as to whether or not the narratives we've been told were true or false, or mixed with some greed from some corporations that had vested interests in us not understanding the full picture, and also some theologies that go way back to Hellenistic culture in the first century of the Greco-Roman world that may have not served as well in many areas of separating bodies, souls, and minds, not only in the area of climate change, but just embodying our own healing in various ways moving forward in our lives, and not understanding how to do that well based on separating those. And so as he spoke today, I'd be curious to know what stuck out to you. When it comes to climate change, it's rapidly happening. And like we mentioned, Gen Z has a whole different perspective on it than maybe Gen X or boomers did, because of the way the world has changed, the way storms are coming in different ways, the way places are hotter than they used to be, the way that snow is piling up in places that it never has, just all these various things that are happening that are just different changes on our planet. My family recently, because of my oldest son, is a person who's always been very interested in climate change since he was just a little boy. He would check out books from the library in Singapore when he was just a little shrimp, 8, 7 years old, and really fascinated by climate change. And he got us into the show on Apple TV recently that we just, the last episode just aired on Earth Day. But it's called, if you want to check it out, it's called Extrapolations. No, they do not sponsor this podcast. Although if Apple wanted to sponsor my podcast, I would absolutely welcome that. But this has some great acting in it. It's 8 different interconnected stories in this show called Extrapolations that's told over 33 years to explore how our planet's changing climate will affect family, work, faith, and survival. So if you watch Extrapolations or you've recently watched it, I'd love to have a little conversation with you on Twitter, or if you join us in our Patreon community, we can comment there on this exclusive episode that Kyle ended up hanging around for another question about. I asked him what was the hardest question or difference he often had to address when he talked with people about climate change. So he dug deep into that. And so if you're in our Patreon community or want to join us, you're always welcome for as little as $5 a month and get some free merch if you stick around. But in there, we dig a little deeper into the episodes with our podcast guests. So Kyle stuck around for that, and I'd love for you to join us there for that conversation. Once again, we need as many brains around this issue as possible. Solving the climate change crisis is not going to happen by just one person from one generation who speaks one language and one culture. Like he said, the Paris Agreement in 2015, all these nations had to be around the table, even Saudi Arabia, who has a vested interest in keeping the oil production going. So if they're even at the table, then certainly we can be at the table trying to figure out how we can move forward in a way where all image bearers around the world and all of creation can flourish together for many generations to come. So thank you for being here today. Thank you for listening. It means a great deal to me. You're making such a world of difference wherever you are. And I would love to hear about the difference that you're making. Hang in there, keep doing it, and let us know how we can be inspired by the work that you're doing. And we'll talk again next week. Bye, everyone. As we're finishing this episode, if you're thinking, I really wish I could learn more or go a little bit deeper. Well, that's what our Difference Maker community is for. I would love to welcome you in to join the rest of us there. Once again, it's only $5 a month to join, the price of a latte at your local coffee shop. You can join at our Changers tier. Difference Makers is a community that really means so much to me. It's very special because each time I have a guest on the show, I record something outside of what we give to just the regular podcast audience, where we go a little bit deeper. And then I post those video episodes in this community and we can discuss them. But also at the very beginning tier, which is our Changers tier of this community, you'll get exclusive voting power and help pick podcast topics that give us, more of what we want from your perspective. You'll have access to exclusive 30 plus mini-sodes that aren't out there for the general public. And you'll get every month an exclusive monthly bonus mini-sode. At our Groundbreakers level, which is $10 a month, you can join and get all of that, but also priority access to submit questions to the podcast. And you'll get an additional 2 exclusive monthly bonus mini-sodes. And at our Trailblazers tier, which is $15 a month, the price of 3 lattes a month, you can get all of that, plus also 3 exclusive monthly bonus minisodes, and a patron shout out. So I would love for you to join us at any of those tiers. It'll help you come into this community, be in the midst of all of us, other difference makers, and we'd love to hear your perspective. I certainly would. It's a place to engage more with me and the audience around what you like, what you're resonating with, and once again, go deeper with each of our guests. So please join us in this membership community. I would love to hear your perspective and love to share this extra content with you. So show up at patreon.com/a world of difference.